Start Hour 15. Page 452. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC. COVID and Structural Reform. COVID-19 exposed the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, as perhaps the most incompetent and arrogant agency in the federal government. CDC continually misjudged COVID-19, from its lethality, transmissibility, and origins to treatments. We were told masks were not needed, then they were made mandatory. CDC botched the development of COVID tests when they were needed most. When it was too late, we were told to put our lives on hold for 2 weeks to flatten the curve. That turned into 2 years of interference and restrictions on the smallest details of our lives. Congress should ensure that CDC's legal authorities are clearly defined and limited to prevent a recurrence of any such arbitrary and vacillating exercise of power. The CDC should be split into 2 separate entities housing its 2 distinct functions. On the one hand, the CDC is now responsible for collecting, synthesizing, and publishing epidemiological data from the individual states, a scientific data gathering function. This information is crucial for medical and public health researchers around the country. On the other hand, the CDC is also responsible for making public health recommendations and policies, an inescapably political function. At times, these 2 functions are in tension or clear conflict. In February 2022, for example, it was reported that with full years into the pandemic, the agency leading the country's response to the public health emergency has published only a tiny fraction of the data it has collected, much of which could have helped state and local health officials better target their efforts to bring the virus under control. A CDC spokesman said that one of the reasons was fear that the information might be misinterpreted. These distinct functions should be separated into 2 entirely separate agencies with a firewall between them. We need a national epidemiological agency responsible only for publishing data and required by law to publish all of the data gathered from states and other sources. A separate agency should be responsible for public health with a severely confined ability to make policy recommendations. The CDC can and should make assessments as to the health costs and benefits of health interventions, but it has limited to no capacity to measure the social costs or benefits they may entail. For example, how much risk mitigation is worth the price of shutting down churches on the holiest day of the Christian calendar and far beyond, as happened in 2020? What is the proper balance of lives saved versus souls saved? The CDC has no business making such inherently political and often unconstitutional assessments and should be required by law to stay in its lane. The CDC's initial COVID-19 testing failures were largely the result of that agency's prioritizing its own development and production of tests using its internal staff and facilities. The private sector is much better positioned to tackle the challenges inherent in developing and manufacturing novel products, as illustrated by the relative success of the alternative approach to facilitating the development of COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics by private companies that was adopted by the Food and Drug Administration, FDA. When it comes to testing, the CDC's role should similarly be to facilitate rather than supplant the efforts of private test developers, academic laboratories, state public health laboratories, and clinical testing providers. When responding to a novel pathogen, the CDC should focus on gathering and disseminating information, including specimens needed for development of positive controls and reference panels, and ensuring that test developers can develop and validate diagnostic tests. These changes will require a shift in priorities and culture at the CDC and throughout HHS more broadly. Most problematically, the CDC presented itself as a kind of superdoctor for the entire nation. The CDC is a public health institution, not a medical institution. According to its mission statement, the agency focuses on disease prevention and control, environmental health, and health promotion and health education activities. It is not qualified to offer, and usually does not purport to offer, professional medical opinions applicable to specific patients. From time to time, the CDC offers findings and recommendations that competent medical practitioners often will consider in arriving at a professional medical judgment for a particular patient. In this respect, CDC guidelines are analogous to guidelines from other public health associations or medical societies. They are informative, not prescriptive. By statute or regulation, CDC guidance must be prohibited from taking on a prescriptive character. For example, never again should CDC officials be allowed to say in their official capacity that school children should be masked or vaccinated, through a schedule or otherwise, or prohibited from learning in a school building. Such decisions should be left to parents and medical providers. We have learned that when CDC says what people should do, it readily becomes a must, backed by severe punishments, including criminal penalties. CDC should report on the risks and effectiveness of all infectious disease mitigation measures dispassionately and leave the should and must policy calls to politically accountable parties. Conflicts of interest. There was a time when the CDC could not take money from the pharmaceutical industry, but in 1992, the agency discovered a loophole in federal law that allowed it to accept pharma contributions through the nonprofit CDC Foundation. The money started flowing immediately. From 2014 through 2018, the CDC Foundation received $79.6 million from pharmaceutical corporations like Pfizer, Biogen, and Merck. This practice presents a stark conflict of interest that should be banned. Data systems. The COVID-19 pandemic has revealed the disastrous public health consequences of the CDC's failure to follow multiple congressional mandates to modernize its data infrastructure. Current reporting methods are burdensome for frontline medical workers, yet they result only in fragmented data that are not available in real time or usable across systems. Congress should require HHS to prioritize the electronic collection and dissemination of robust, privacy-protected data that better leverages existing systems while reducing burdens on clinicians. HHS should also enter into a public-private partnership with a data management expert to develop a system that makes critical information available to healthcare workers and policymakers in real time. The CDC operates several programs related to vaccine safety, including the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, VAERS, Vaccine Safety Data Link, VSD, and Clinical Immunization Safety Assessment, CISA, project. Those functions and their associated funding should be transferred to the FDA, which is responsible for post-market surveillance and evaluation of all other drugs and biological products. Respect for life and conscience. The CDC should eliminate programs and projects that do not respect human life and conscience rights and that undermine family formation. It should ensure that it is not promoting abortion as healthcare. It should fund studies into the risks and complications of abortion and ensure that it corrects and does not promote misinformation regarding the comparative health and psychological benefits of childbirth versus the health and psychological risks of intentionally taking a human life through abortion. The CDC oversaw and funded the development and testing of the COVID-19 vaccines with aborted fetal cell lines, insensitive to the consciences of tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of people who objected to taking a vaccine with such a link to abortion. As evidenced by litigation across the country, it is likely that thousands were fired unjustly because of the exercise of their consciences or faith on this question, which could have been avoided with a modicum of concern for this issue from CDC. There is never any justification for ending a child's life as part of research, and the research benefits from splicing or growing aborted fetal cells and aborted baby body parts can easily be provided by alternative sources. All such research should be prohibited as a matter of law and policy. CDC should update its public messaging about the unsurpassed effectiveness of modern fertility awareness-based methods, FABs, of family planning and stop publishing communications that conflate such methods with the long-eclipsed rhythm or calendar methods. CDC should fund studies exploring the evidence-based methods used in cutting-edge fertility awareness. Data collection. The CDC's abortion surveillance and maternity mortality reporting systems are woefully inadequate. CDC abortion data are reported by states on a voluntary basis, and California, Maryland, and New Hampshire do not submit abortion data at all. Accurate and reliable statistical data about abortion, abortion survivors, and abortion-related maternal deaths are essential to timely, reliable public health and policy analysis. Because liberal states have now become sanctuaries for abortion tourism, HHS should use every available tool, including the cutting of funds, to ensure that every state reports exactly how many abortions take place within its borders, at what gestational age of the child, for what reason, the mother's state of residence, and by what method. It should also ensure that statistics are separated by category: spontaneous miscarriage, treatments that incidentally result in the death of a child, such as chemotherapy, stillbirths, and induced abortion. In addition, CDC should require monitoring and reporting for complications due to abortion and every instance of children being born alive after an abortion. Moreover, abortion should be clearly defined as only those procedures that intentionally end an unborn child's life. Miscarriage management or standard ectopic pregnancy treatments should never be conflated with abortion. Comparisons between live births and abortion should be tracked across various demographic indicators to assess whether certain populations are targeted by abortion providers and whether better prenatal physical, mental, and social care improves infant outcomes and decreases abortion rates, especially among those who are most vulnerable. The Ensuring Accurate and Complete Abortion Data Reporting Act of 20,239 would amend Title 19 of the Social Security Act and Public Health Service Act to improve the CDC's abortion reporting mechanisms by requiring states, as a condition of federal Medicaid payments for family planning services, to report streamlined variables in a timely manner. The CDC should immediately end its collection of data on gender identity, which legitimizes the unscientific notion that men can become women, and vice versa, and encourages the phenomenon of ever-multiplying subjective identities. Food and Drug Administration, FDA. The FDA's mission includes ensuring the safety and efficacy of drugs, biological products, and medical devices. Federal laws that shield big pharma from competition. Because generics generally cost far less than brand-name drugs, consumers begin to save money as soon as a generic product comes on the market. The vast majority are very affordable, with 93% of generic products costing $20 or less. Savings would be even higher under proposals that prevent brand-name manufacturers from slowing down or impeding the entrance of generic products into the marketplace. Specifically, the FDA should prohibit pharmaceutical companies from purposely sitting on their legally available right to be the first to sell generic versions of their drugs. Additionally, Congress should create legal remedies for generic companies to obtain samples of brand name products for their generic development efforts and should prohibit meritless citizen petitions submitted by manufacturers to delay approval of a generic competitor. Approval process for laboratory-developed or modified medical tests. Learning from the failed early COVID-19 testing experience, Congress and the FDA should focus on reforming laws and regulations governing medical tests, especially with respect to laboratory-developed tests. Commercial tests are developed with the intention of being widely marketed, distributed, and used, while laboratory-developed tests are created with the intention of being used solely within one laboratory. A test developed by a lab in accordance with the protocols developed by another lab, non-commercial sharing, currently constitutes a new, laboratory-developed test because the lab in which it will be used is different from the initial developing lab. To encourage interlaboratory collaboration and discourage duplicative test creation and associated regulatory and logistical burdens, the FDA should introduce mechanisms through which laboratory-developed tests can easily be shared with other laboratories without the current regulatory burdens. The lab in which it will be used is different from the initial developing lab. To encourage interlaboratory collaboration and discourage duplicative test creation and associated regulatory and logistical burdens, the FDA should introduce mechanisms through which laboratory-developed tests can easily be shared with other laboratories without the current regulatory burdens. The laboratory-developed tests category currently encompasses a range of possible tests, many of which would be characterized more appropriately as laboratory-modified tests, because they are not truly novel tests, but rather modified versions of existing tests. To avoid stifling innovation and access to medical care, the applicable statutes and regulations should be revised to facilitate greater access to such modified tests. Finally, the FDA has long held that it has regulatory authority over such tests, while others have argued that they should be considered clinical services regulated by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS. The FDA currently has regulatory authority over in vitro diagnostics, and under the Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments, CLA, the CMS ensures that labs meet analytical validity standards for test methods. Congress, the FDA, and the CMS need to clarify and disentangle overlapping authorities over tests to eliminate regulatory confusion. Drug shortages. The very thin profit margins and the regulatory burdens associated with generic drug manufacturing discourage inventory and capacity investments by manufacturers and contribute to drug shortages. HHS and the FDA should encourage more dependable generic drug manufacturing. The FDA should expand its current pass/fail approach to drug facility inspections into a graded system that recognizes manufacturers that exceed minimum standards by investing in improving production reliability. The FDA should also add facility codes to drug packaging and construct a searchable database that cross-references product codes and facility codes. That would enable wholesalers and pharmacy benefit managers to identify and preference drugs manufactured at more reliable facilities, thus encouraging generic drug manufacturers to compete on reliability as well as on price. For its part, HHS should exempt multi-source generic drugs from requirements to pay rebates to Medicaid and other federally funded health programs, as those provisions penalize new investments in expanding manufacturing capacity when supply is unable to meet demand. Additionally, FDA and NIH should promote efficacy trials of new applications for generic drugs, which might include NIH funding such trials or conducting its own. Abortion pills. Abortion pills pose the single greatest threat to unborn children in a post-Roe world. The rate of chemical abortion in the U.S. has increased by more than 150% in the past decade. More than half of annual abortions in the U.S. are chemical rather than surgical. The abortion pill regimen is typically a two-part process. The first pill, mifepristone, causes the death of the unborn child by cutting off the hormone progesterone, which is required to sustain a pregnancy. The second pill, misoprostol, causes contractions to induce a delivery of the dead child and uterine contents, usually into a toilet at home. The abortion pill regimen is currently approved for up to 70 days, 10 weeks, into pregnancy, and before Biden was subject to a heightened safety restriction called a Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategy, REMS. That requires an in-person visit with a physician who can check for dangerous contraindications such as ectopic pregnancies and can advise the mother seeking an abortion of the risks of chemical abortion, including hemorrhaging, and what to do in such circumstances. Chemical abortion has been found to have a complication rate 4 times higher than that of surgical abortion. Since its approval more than 20 years ago, mifepristone has been associated with 26 deaths of pregnant mothers, over 1,000 hospitalizations, and thousands more adverse events, but that number does not account for all complications. Of course, this does not count the hundreds of thousands to millions of babies whose lives have been unjustly taken through chemical abortion. FDA should therefore reverse its approval of chemical abortion drugs because the politicized approval process was illegal from the start. The FDA failed to abide by its legal obligations to protect the health, safety, and welfare of girls and women. It never studied the safety of the drugs under the labeled conditions of use, ignored the potential impacts of the hormone-blocking regimen on the developing bodies of adolescent girls, disregarded the substantial evidence that chemical abortion drugs cause more complications than surgical abortions, and eliminated necessary safeguards for pregnant girls and women who undergo this dangerous drug regimen. Furthermore, at no point in the past 2 decades has the FDA ever acknowledged or addressed federal laws that prohibit the distribution of abortion drugs by postal mail. To the contrary, the FDA has permitted and actively encouraged such activity. Now that the Supreme Court has acknowledged that the Constitution contains no right to an abortion, the FDA is ethically and legally obliged to revisit and withdraw its initial approval, which was premised on pregnancy being an illness and abortion being therapeutically effective at treating this illness. The FDA is statutorily charged with guaranteeing the safety and efficacy of drugs, and therefore should withdraw this drug that is proven to be dangerous to women and by definition fatally unsafe for unborn children. As an interim step, the FDA should immediately restore the REMS by removing the in-person dispensing requirement to eliminate dangerous teleabortion and abortion by mail distribution. Mail-order abortions. Allowing mail-order abortions is a gift to the abortion industry that allows it to expand far beyond brick-and-mortar clinics and into pro-life states that are trying to protect women, girls, and unborn children from abortion. The FDA should therefore reinstate earlier safety protocols for mifeprex that were mostly eliminated in 2016 and apply these protocols to any generic version of mifepristone. A bare minimum policy of limiting abortion pills to the pre-2016 policy of 49 days gestation, returning to the pre-2021 in-person dispensing requirement, and returning to requiring prescribers to report all serious adverse events, not just deaths, to the drug sponsor would increase women's health and safety. Address weaknesses in the current FARS, FDA adverse events reporting system. The administration and policymakers should ensure that healthcare workers, particularly those in hospitals and emergency rooms, report abortion pill complications. Women who experience complications from abortion pills typically go to an emergency room, not to the abortion pill prescriber. So putting the onus of reporting on the prescriber, who typically has no idea that a complication has occurred, means that the FARS is seriously undercounting adverse events. Submitting an adverse event to the database should be a quick and efficient process for busy healthcare practitioners. Currently, providers report that the process is difficult and convoluted. Implement a policy of transparency about inspections of the abortion pill sponsors, Danco and GenBioPro, as well as facilities that manufacture the pills. The FDA should respond to Congressional Requests and Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, requests about inspections, compliance, and post-marketing safety in a timely manner. Stop promoting or approving mail-order abortions in violation of long-standing federal laws that prohibit the mailing and interstate carriage of abortion drugs. Vaccine importation. Thousands of Americans of faith and conscience wish to receive various childhood vaccinations for themselves and their families, but are not allowed to receive vaccines that are derived through or tested on aborted fetal cells. For example, the chickenpox, hepatitis, and MMR vaccines in the US are all linked to abortion in this way. There are ethically derived alternatives abroad that have been used safely there for decades, but the FDA makes it exceedingly difficult for Americans to import them. In January 2021, the HHS Office for Civil Rights, OCR, and the FDA jointly announced that HHS was required by the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, RFRA, to allow bulk importation by doctors of certain Japanese-made vaccines to accommodate religious needs of patients, but the Biden FDA unlawfully revoked this waiver. The FDA should restore the waiver to comply with RFRA and for the obvious public health benefits of increased childhood vaccination by families seeking ethically derived alternatives. To avoid future moral coercion of the sort experienced with the COVID-19 vaccines, the FDA and NIH should require the development of drugs and biologics that are free from moral taint and switch to cell lines that are not derived from aborted fetal cell lines or aborted baby body parts. Conflicts of interest. A 2018 report in Science found that more than 2/3 of FDA reviewers later ended up at the same companies whose products they had been reviewing while they were working for the government. This revolving door is one mechanism by which pharmaceutical companies capture the agencies that regulate them. The FDA should impose a lengthy cooling-off period for reviewers, preventing them from working for companies they regulated. In 1997, the FDA relaxed regulations to permit broadcast drug advertisements, after which Big Pharma began routine direct-to-consumer advertising, making the United States and New Zealand the only countries where such practices are legal. Following the 1997 changes, Pharma became the largest advertiser for all major media organizations. This buys considerable influence in the newsroom, whether media companies acknowledge this or not, and distorts independent reporting on public health issues. The FDA or Congress should regulate where and how paid advertising is used by pharmaceutical companies more stringently, especially on media outlets. National Institutes of Health, NIH. The National Institutes of Health, NIH, is the world's largest biomedical research agency and is made up of 27 different components called institutes and centers. Despite its popular image as a benign science agency, NIH was responsible for paying for research in aborted baby body parts, human-animal chimera experiments, and gain-of-function viral research that may have been responsible for COVID-19. Bioethics reform. Research using fetal tissue obtained from elective abortions is immoral and obsolete. Research using human embryonic stem cells also involves the destruction of human life and should not be subsidized with taxpayer dollars. Good science and life-affirming, ethical research are not mutually exclusive. In fact, ethically derived sources such as discarded surgical tissue and adult stem cells, made pluripotent, not tissue obtained from elective abortions, have contributed the most successful treatments for a variety of ailments. Congress authorized HHS to choose not to fund extramural abortion-derived fetal tissue research that fails Ethics Advisory Board review, and in 2019, the Trump administration's HHS chose that course. Subsequently, however, the Biden administration restored unrestricted funding of abortion-derived fetal tissue research. HHS should promptly restore the Ethics Advisory Committee to oversee abortion-derived fetal tissue research, and Congress should prohibit such research altogether. End intramural research projects using tissue from aborted children within the NIH, which should end its human embryonic stem cell registry. Aggressively implement a plan to pursue and fund ethical alternative methods of research in order to ensure that abortion and embryo-destructive related research, cell lines, and other testing methods become both fully obsolete and ethically unthinkable. YAD is essential to human nature, and because every child has a right to a mother and father, three-parent embryo creation and human cloning research should be banned. A new NCB should convene leading experts to examine these issues and provide policy recommendations for the new frontier of bioethical questions that our country will have to address in the coming years. Finally, HHS should create and promote a research agenda that supports pro-life policies and explores the harms, both mental and physical, that abortion has wrought on women and girls. Conflicts of interest. NIH maintains inappropriate industry ties that create serious conflicts of interest. In 2018, it was revealed that a $100 million NIH study on the benefits of moderate drinking was funded by the beer and liquor industry. More recently, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, NIAID, Anthony Fauci's division of the NIH, owns half of the patent for the Moderna COVID-19 vaccine, among thousands of other pharma patents. Rather than providing grants to university-based investigators to run the clinical trials on their own Moderna vaccine, the NIH conducted this research internally, a clear conflict of interest. The NIAID will earn millions from this vaccine's revenue, with several NIH employees and their heirs personally receiving up to $150,000 annually from Moderna vaccine sales. In May 2022, documents obtained pursuant to a FOIA request revealed that NIH Director Francis Collins, NIAID Director Anthony Fauci, and Fauci's Deputy Director, Clifford Lane, all received royalties from pharmaceutical companies between 2009 and 2014. Nonprofit watchdog Open the Books estimates that from 2010 to 2020, third parties paid more than $350 million in royalties to NIH and its scientists, who are credited as co-inventors. Most problematically, in the years when they received payments, Collins, Fauci, and Lane were NIH administrators, not researchers, with no plausible claim to be scientific co-discoverers. Most of the world's other advanced science countries have stricter prohibitions on such conflicts, which helps to explain why the most significant studies on COVID treatments, on natural immunity, and on vaccine efficacy have come mostly from outside the U.S. Funding for scientific research should not be controlled by a small group of highly paid and unaccountable insiders at the NIH, many of whom stay in power for decades. The NIH monopoly on directing research should be broken. Term limits should be imposed on top career leaders at the NIH, and Congress should consider block granting NIH grants budget to states to fund their own scientific research. Nothing in the system would prevent several states from partnering to co-fund large research projects that require greater resources or impact larger regions. Likewise, the establishment of funding for scientific research at the state level does not preclude more modest federal funding through the National Institutes of Health. The two models are not mutually exclusive. The CDC and NIH foundations, whose boards are populated with pharmaceutical company executives, need to be decommissioned. Private donations to these foundations, a majority of them from pharmaceutical companies, should not be permitted to influence government decisions about research funding or public health policy. Woke policies. Under Francis Collins, NIH became so focused on the #MeToo movement that it refused to sponsor scientific conferences unless there were a certain number of women panelists, which violates federal civil rights law against sex discrimination. This quota practice should be ended, and the NIH Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, which pushes such unlawful actions, should be abolished. NIH has been at the forefront in pushing junk gender science. Instead, it should fund studies into the short-term and long-term negative effects of cross-sex interventions, including affirmation, puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgeries, and the likelihood of desistance if young people are given counseling that does not include medical or social interventions. Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS. With the goal of being a societal safety net, Medicare and Medicaid touch more American lives than does any other federal program. While they help many, they operate as runaway entitlements that stifle medical innovation, encourage fraud, and impede cost containment, in addition to which their fiscal future is in peril. Both programs should be managed so that the individuals enrolled are empowered to make decisions for themselves and have quality options with affordable prices driven by competition and innovation. Providers who participate should retain, or have restored, the freedom to practice medicine and take care of their patients according to their patients' unique needs. Medicare should be reformed according to 4 goals and principles. Increase Medicare beneficiaries' control of their health care. Patients are best positioned to determine the value of healthcare services, working with their healthcare providers. They also benefit from increased choice of doctors, hospitals, and insurance plans. Access to reliable information with respect to physicians, hospitals, and insurers is therefore essential. Reduce regulatory burdens on doctors. Doctors must be free to focus on treating patients first, not entering codes on computers, and should not be tempted to change their medical judgment based on arbitrary or illogical reimbursement incentives. Ensure sustainability and value for beneficiaries and taxpayers. Prices are best for patients when determined by economic value rather than political power and when they are known in advance of the receipt of services. Government's use of non-market-based methods to determine reimbursement leads to overspending on low-value services and products and underpayment for high-value services and products, stifles beneficial innovation, and because of Medicare's size distorts payments throughout the healthcare system. Intermediate entities that can manage financial risk and ensure quality of care are important in transitioning to value-based care within the Medicare program. Reduce waste, fraud, and abuse, including through the use of artificial intelligence for their detection. Regulatory reforms. Medicare regulations restrict choice of coverage and care. The next administration should reintroduce and restore regulations and demonstrations from the Trump administration that were withdrawn, weakened, or never finalized by the Biden administration, including the Medicare Coverage of Innovative Technologies, MCT rule, the Risk Adjustment Data Validation, RADV rule, the Medicare Advantage Qualifying Payment Arrangement Incentive, MAQI, demonstration, and the Global and Professional Direct Contracting, GPDC, rebranded as the Accountable Care Organization Realizing Equity, Access, and Community Health or ACO REACH model. Additionally, regulations should advance site neutrality by eliminating the inpatient-only list and expanding the ambulatory surgical center covered procedures list. Medicare generally pays more for inpatient hospital procedures and less for the same procedures performed in an outpatient setting. Whether a medical service is delivered in a physician's office, a clinic, or a hospital setting, the Medicare payment for that service should be the same. CMS should expand the application of site-neutral payment options to more settings. Such a policy would level the playing field among providers and remove the financial disabilities for medical professionals who would compete with hospital systems. Finally, HHS needs to restore and enhance conscience protection regulations that allow medical practitioners to participate in federal healthcare programs without being compelled to provide sex changes or similar services. Legislative proposals. Remove restrictions on physician-owned hospitals. The Affordable Care Act, ACA, imposed restrictions prohibiting Medicare from reimbursing physician-owned and specialty hospitals. The current restrictions do little more than serve the special interests of large hospital systems and undercut consumer choice of high-quality, specialty care. These restrictions should be removed so that physician-owned hospitals can compete with other hospitals in serving Medicare patients. Encourage more direct competition between Medicare Advantage and private plans. Medicare Advantage, MA, a system of competing private health plans, is the major alternative to traditional Medicare for America's large and growing cohort of seniors. The program provides beneficiaries with a wide range of competitive health plan choices, a richer set of benefits than traditional Medicare provides, and at a reasonable cost. Equally as important, the MA program has been registering consistently high marks for superior performance in delivering high-quality care. Critical reforms are still needed to strengthen and improve the program for the future. Specifically, 1. Make Medicare Advantage the default enrollment option. 2. Give beneficiaries direct control of how they spend Medicare dollars. 3. Remove burdensome policies that micromanage MA plans. 4. Replace the complex formula-based payment model with a competitive bidding model. 5. Reconfigure the current risk adjustment model. 6. Remove restrictions on key benefits and services, including those related to prescription drugs, hospice care, and medical savings account plans. Legacy Medicare reform. Legislation reforming legacy, non-MA, Medicare should base payments on the health status of the patient or intensity of the service rather than where the patient happens to receive that service. Replace the bureaucrat-driven fee-for-service system with value-based payments to empower patients to find the care that best serves their needs. Codify price transparency regulations. Restructure 340B drug subsidies toward beneficiaries rather than hospitals. Repeal harmful health policies enacted under the Obama and Biden administrations, such as the Medicare Shared Savings Program and Inflation Reduction Act. Revise their needs. Codify price transparency regulations. Restructure 340B drug subsidies toward beneficiaries rather than hospitals. Repeal harmful health policies enacted under the Obama and Biden administrations, such as the Medicare Shared Savings Program and Inflation Reduction Act. Medicare Part D reform. The Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, created a drug price negotiation program in Medicare that replaced the existing private sector negotiations in Part D with government price controls for prescription drugs. These government price controls will limit access to medications and reduce patient access to new medication. This negotiation program should be repealed, and reforms in Part D that will have meaningful impact for seniors should be pursued. Other reforms should include eliminating the coverage gap in Part D, reducing the government share in the catastrophic tier, and requiring manufacturers to bear a larger share. Until the IRA is repealed, an administration that is required to implement it must do so in a way that is prudent with its authority, minimizing the harmful effects of the law's policies and avoiding even worse unintended consequences. Medicaid. Over the past 45 years, Medicaid and the health safety net have evolved into a cumbersome, complicated, and unaffordable burden on nearly every state. The program is failing some of the most vulnerable patients, is a prime target for waste, fraud, and abuse, and is consuming more of state and federal budgets. The dramatic increase in Medicaid expenditures is due in large part to the ACA Obamacare, which mandates that states must expand their Medicaid eligibility standards to include all individuals at or below 138% of the federal poverty level, FPL, and the public health emergency, which has prohibited states from performing basic eligibility reviews. The overlap of available benefits among the various health agencies has led to a complex, confusing system that is nearly impossible to navigate, even for recipients. Recipients are often faced with a welfare cliff of benefit losses as they earn above a certain amount, which is contrary to the fundamental purpose of empowering individuals to achieve economic independence. Services such as air conditioning and housing, many of which are already handled by departments other than HHS. Improper payments within Medicaid are higher than those of any other federal program. These payments are evidence of the inappropriateness of Medicaid's expansion, which, stemming largely from Public Health Emergency Maintenance of Effort, ME, requirements, and the Affordable Care Act, has crowded out the primary targets of these programs, those who are most in need. True healthcare reform cannot be accomplished in a bureaucratic silo or only through Medicaid and health safety net programs. Reform of the tax code is also essential to genuine, effective reform of our healthcare system. All components of the healthcare system should be part of the reform efforts, and it is imperative that the system be modified to assist states with their current programs. Therefore, the next administration should reform financing. Allow states to have a more flexible, accountable, predictable, transparent, and efficient financing mechanism to deliver medical services. This system should include a more balanced or blended match rate, block grants, aggregate caps, or per capita caps. Any financial system should be designed to encourage and incentivize innovation and the efficient delivery of healthcare services. Federal and state financial participation in the Medicaid program should be rational, predictable, and reasonable. It should also incentivize states to save money and improve the quality of healthcare. Direct dollars to beneficiaries more effectively and responsibly. The current funding structure for the Medicaid program rewards expansions, lacks transparency, and promotes financing gimmicks. CMS should 1. End state financing loopholes. 2. Reform payments to hospitals for uncompensated care. 3. Replace the enhanced match rate with a fairer and more rational match rate. 4. Restructure basic financing and put the program on a more fiscally predictable budget, which should include reform of disproportionate share hospital payments to hospitals. Strengthen program integrity. Make program integrity a top priority and the responsibility of the states. To protect the taxpayer's investment. 1. Fiscally predictable budget, which should include reform of disproportionate share hospital payments to hospitals. Strengthen program integrity. Make program integrity a top priority and the responsibility of the states. To protect the taxpayer's investment. 1. Incentivize states. An enhanced contingency fee should be paid to states that successfully increase their efforts to decrease waste, fraud, and abuse. The current system's IT development 90-10 matching rate should be allowed for improvements in states' current fraud and abuse and eligibility systems. Innovative programs that show a positive return on investment for both the state and federal governments should be allowed without the onerous waiver process. 2. Improve Medicaid eligibility standards to protect those in need. As Medicaid enrollment continues to climb, it is imperative that there are appropriate and accurate eligibility standards to ensure that the program remains focused on serving those who are in need. To this end, CMS should A. Hold states accountable for improper eligibility determinations. B. Require more robust eligibility determinations. C. Strengthen asset test determinations within Medicaid. 3. Conduct oversight and reform of managed care. Incentivize personal responsibility. CMS should allow states to ensure that Medicaid recipients have a stake in their personal health care and a say in decisions related to the Medicaid program. Personal responsibility and consumer choice for Medicaid recipients must go together as standard components of the safety net, especially for able-bodied recipients. Medicaid recipients, like the rest of Americans, should be given both the freedom to choose their health plans and the responsibility to contribute to their healthcare costs at a level that is appropriate to protect the taxpayer. Add work requirements and match Medicaid benefits to beneficiary needs. Because Medicaid serves a broad and diverse group of individuals, it should be flexible enough to accommodate different designs for different groups. For example, CMS should launch a robust, personal option to allow families to use Medicaid dollars to secure coverage outside of the Medicaid program. CMS should also, 1. Clarify that states have the ability to adopt work incentives for able-bodied individuals, similar to what is required in other welfare programs, and the ability to broaden the application of targeted premiums and cost-sharing to higher-income enrollees. 2. Add targeted time limits or lifetime caps on benefits to disincentivize permanent dependence. Allow private health insurance. Congress should allow states the option of contributing to a private insurance benefit for all members of the family in a flexible account that rewards healthy behaviors. This reform should also allow catastrophic coverage combined with an account similar to a health savings account, HSA, for the direct purchase of healthcare and payment of cost sharing for most of the population. Increase flexible benefit redesign without waivers. CMS should add flexibility to eliminate obsolete mandatory and optional benefit requirements and, for able-bodied recipients, eliminate benefit mandates that exceed those in the private market. This should include flexibility to redesign eligibility, financing, and service delivery of long-term care to serve the most vulnerable and truly needy and eliminate middle-income to upper-income Medicaid recipients. Eliminate current waiver and state plan processes. CMS should allow providers to make payment reforms without cumbersome waivers or state plan amendment processes where possible. More broadly, the federal government's role should be oversight on broad indicators like cost effectiveness and health measures like quality, health improvement, and wellness, and should give the balance of responsibility for Medicaid program management to states. This reform would include adding Section 111535 waiver requirements in some cases, such as imposing work requirements for able-bodied adults, while rescinding requirements in others, such as non-healthcare benefits and services related to climate change. Affordable Care Act and private health insurance. Remove barriers to direct primary care. Direct primary care, DPC, is an innovative healthcare delivery model in which doctors contract directly with patients for their care on a subscription basis regardless of how or where the care is provided. The DPC model is improving patient access, driving higher quality and lower cost, and strengthening the doctor-patient relationship. DPC has faced many challenges from government policymakers, including overly exuberant attempts at regulation and misclassification. Changes should clarify that DPC's fixed fee for care does not constitute insurance in the context of health savings accounts. Revisit the No Surprises Act on surprise medical billing. The No Surprises Act protected consumers against balance bills, but it also established a deeply flawed system for resolving payment disputes between insurers and providers. This government-mandated dispute resolution process has sown confusion among arbiters and regulators as judges have sought to ascertain its meaning. The No Surprises Act should scrap the dispute resolution process in favor of a truth-in-advertising approach that will protect consumers and free doctors, insurers, and arbiters from confused and conflicting standards for resolving disputes that the disputing parties can best resolve themselves. Facilitate the development of shared savings and reference pricing plan options. Under traditional insurance, patients who choose lower-cost care do not benefit financially from that choice. Barriers to rewarding patients for cost-saving decisions should be removed. CMS should ensure that shared savings and reference pricing models that reward consumers are permitted. Separate the subsidized ACA exchange market from the non-subsidized insurance market. The Affordable Care Act has made insurance more expensive and less competitive, and the ACA subsidy scheme simply masks these impacts. To make health insurance coverage more affordable for those who are without government subsidies, CMS should develop a plan to separate the non-subsidized insurance market from the subsidized market, giving the non-subsidized market regulatory relief from the costly ACA regulatory mandates. Strengthen hospital price transparency. In 2020, CMS completed its rule to require hospitals to post the prices of common hospital procedures. Future updates of these rules should focus on including quality measures. Combined with the shared savings models and other consumer tools, these efforts could deliver considerable savings for consumers. Center for Consumer Information and Insurance Oversight, CCIO. CMS also plays an outsized role in overseeing the Obamacare exchanges, including managing healthcare.gov, through the Center for Consumer Information and Insurance Oversight, CCIO. While Obamacare limits plan options, CCIO has been overly prescriptive in dictating what benefits and types of health plans may participate in the exchanges, thereby actually stifling market innovation and driving up costs. Congress should build on the Trump administration's efforts to expand choices for small businesses and workers, both in and out of the exchanges, by codifying an expansion of association health plans, short-term health plans, and health reimbursement arrangements, including individual coverage HRAs. CCIO should also work with the Treasury Department and the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, to give consumers more flexibility with their healthcare dollars through expanded access to health savings accounts. Emergency preparedness. Expand the scope of practice of low-complexity and moderate-complexity clinical laboratories during the COVID-19 pandemic, allowing laboratories greater regulatory flexibility regarding CLA requirements increased access to testing. However, the need for regulatory flexibility is not limited to emergency situations. Ongoing innovations in medical care will continue to drive demand for clinical testing and new tests. One way that increasing demand for other medical services has been accommodated is by revising restrictions on scope of practice to enable providers to practice at the so-called top of their license. CMS should similarly revise CLA rules regarding scope of practice for clinical laboratories and testing personnel. Create CLA certification equivalent pathways for non-clinical laboratories and researchers. The COVID-19 pandemic revealed that the U.S. needs to leverage the expertise of non-clinical laboratories and researchers in order to bolster clinical testing capacity. To accomplish this, CMS should create pathways for granting non-clinical laboratories and their testing personnel CLA certification equivalency. Non-clinical researchers already demonstrate their technical expertise through online training and certification programs. CMS should build on that existing framework so that those laboratories and personnel can similarly demonstrate their clinical testing capabilities. Life, conscience, and bodily integrity. Prohibit abortion travel funding. Providing funding for abortions increases the number of abortions and violates the conscience and religious freedom rights of Americans who object to subsidizing the taking of life. The Hyde Amendment has long prohibited the use of HHS funds for elective abortions, but an August 2022 Biden executive order pressed the HHS secretary to use his authority under Section 1115 demonstrations to waive certain provisions of the law in order to use taxpayer funds to achieve the administration's goal of helping women to travel out of state to obtain abortions. Moreover, the Department of Justice Office of Legal Counsel, DOJ OLC, issued a politicized legal opinion declaring, for the first time in the history of Hyde, that this action did not violate the Hyde Amendment and that Hyde applies only to the performance of the abortion itself in violation of the plainly broad language that Congress used. Two of the first actions of a pro-life administration should be for HHS to withdraw the Medicaid guidance and any Section 1115 waivers issued thereunder, and for DOJ OLC to withdraw and disavow its interpretation of the Hyde Amendment. Prohibit Planned Parenthood from receiving Medicaid funds. During the 2020 to 2021 reporting period, Planned Parenthood performed more than 383,000 abortions. The national organization reported more than $133 million in excess revenue and more than $2.1 billion in net assets. During the same year, Planned Parenthood reports that its affiliates received more than $633 million in government funding and more than $579 million in private contributions. Planned Parenthood affiliates face accusations of waste, abuse, and potential fraud with taxpayer dollars, failure to report the sexual abuse of minor girls, and allegations of profiting from the sale of organs from aborted babies. Policymakers should end taxpayer funding of Planned Parenthood and all other abortion providers and redirect funding to health centers that provide real health care for women. The bulk of federal funding for Planned Parenthood comes through the Medicaid program. HHS should take two actions to limit this funding. 1. Issue guidance re-emphasizing that states are free to defund Planned Parenthood in their state Medicaid plans. 2. Propose rulemaking to interpret the Medicaid statute to disqualify providers of elective abortion from the Medicaid program. Congress should pass the Protecting Life and Taxpayers Act, which would accomplish the goal of defunding abortion providers, such as Planned Parenthood. CMS should resolve pending Section 1115 waivers from Idaho, South Carolina, and Tennessee, which, like Texas in January 2022, are seeking both to prohibit abortion providers from participating in state-run Medicaid programs and to work with other states to do the same. Abortion is not healthcare, and states should be free to devise and implement programs that prioritize qualified providers that are not entangled with the abortion industry. Withdraw Medicaid funds for states that require abortion insurance or that discriminate in violation of the Weldon Amendment. The Weldon Amendment declares that no HHS funding may go to a state or local government that discriminates against pro-life health entities or insurers. In blatant violation of this law, 7 states require abortion coverage in private health insurance plans, and HHS continues to fund those states. HHS under President Trump disallowed $200 million in Medicaid funding from California because of the state's flouting of the law, but the Biden administration restored it. HHS/CMS should withdraw appropriated funding, up to and including 10% of Medicaid funds, from states that require abortion insurance coverage. DOJ should commit to litigating the defense of those funding decisions promptly to the Supreme Court in order to maximize HHS's ability to withdraw funds from entities that violate the Weldon Amendment. Additionally, California has announced that it will discriminate against pharmacies that do not carry chemical abortion drugs outside of California. California's discrimination takes the form of cutting state contracts with such pharmacies and clearly violates the Weldon Amendment. The violation should likewise face the penalties discussed above. Rewrite the ACA abortion separate payment regulation. Section 1303 of Obamacare requires that insurers collect a separate payment for certain abortion coverage in qualified health plans that are approved to be sold on exchanges, and that they keep those separate payments in separate accounts that are used only to pay for elective abortion services. Neither the letter nor the spirit of the law was enforced under President Obama, and a Trump-era regulation sought to correct this problem. The Biden HHS rescinded this regulation to allow insurance companies once again, contrary to the law, to collect combined payments for what are clearly required to be separate payments for elective abortion coverage. Separate does not mean together. HHS should reinstate a Trump administration regulation and enforce what the plain text of Section 1303 requires. That regulation should be further improved by requiring CMS to ensure that consumers pay truly separate charges for abortion coverage. Audit Hyde Amendment compliance. HHS should undertake a full audit to determine compliance or non-compliance with the Hyde Amendment and similar funding restrictions in HHS programs. This audit should include a full review of the Biden administration's post-Dobbs executive actions to promote abortion. It should also encompass a review of Medicaid managed care plans in pro-abortion states. Reverse distorted pro-abortion interpretations added to the Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act. The Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act, EMTLA, prohibits hospitals that receive Medicare funds from dumping emergency patients who cannot pay by sending them to other hospitals. It also mandates that hospitals stabilize pregnant women and explicitly protects unborn children. Hospitals or physicians found to be in violation of the statute could lose all of their federal health funding, Medicare, Medicaid, CHIP, and other funds, and face civil penalties of up to nearly $120,000. In July 2022, HHS/CMS released guidance mandating that EMTLA-covered hospitals and the physicians who work there must perform abortions, to include completing chemical abortions even when the child might still be alive. The guidance also declared that EMTLA would protect physicians and hospitals that perform abortions in violation of state law if they deem those abortions necessary to stabilize the women's health. This novel interpretation of EMTLA is baseless. EMTLA requires no abortions, preempts no pro-life state laws, and explicitly requires stabilization of the unborn child. HHS should rescind the guidance and end CMS and state agency investigations into cases of alleged refusals to perform abortions. DOJ should agree to eliminate existing injunctions against pro-life states, withdraw its enforcement lawsuits, and in lawsuits against CMS on the guidance agree to injunctions against CMS and withdraw appeals of injunctions. Reissue a stronger transgender national coverage determination. CMS should repromulgate its 2016 decision that CMS could not issue a national coverage determination, NCD, regarding gender reassignment surgery for Medicare beneficiaries. In doing so, CMS should acknowledge the growing body of evidence that such interventions are dangerous and acknowledge that there is insufficient scientific evidence to support such coverage in state plans. Enforce EMTLA. The undeniable reality of abortion is that it do not always result in a dead baby, and these born-alive babies are left to die. HHS should use EMTLA and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which prohibits disability discrimination, to investigate instances of infants born alive and left untreated in covered hospitals. CMS, OCR, and OIG should be required to follow through on these investigations with specific enforcement actions. HHS should revive a Trump administration proposed regulation, special responsibilities of Medicare hospitals in emergency cases and discrimination on the basis of disability in critical health and human service programs or activities to achieve this end. In addition, Congress should pass the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act to require that proper medical care be given to infants who survive an abortion and to establish criminal consequences for practitioners who fail to provide such care. Permanently codify both the Hyde family of amendments and the protections provided by the Weldon Amendment. Congress can accomplish this through legislation such as the No Taxpayer Funding for Abortion and Abortion Insurance Full Disclosure Act, Hyde, and the Conscience Protection Act, Weldon. Radical redefinition of sex. On August 4, 2022, HHS published a proposed rule entitled Non-Discrimination in Health Programs and Activities. This rule addresses non-discrimination provisions of the Affordable Care Act, known as Section 1557, which is enforced by the Office for Civil Rights and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Section 1557 prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin, age, disability, and sex in covered health programs or activities. Under the proposed rule, sex is redefined. Discrimination on the basis of sex includes, but is not limited to, discrimination on the basis of sex stereotypes, sex characteristics, including intersex traits, pregnancy or related conditions, sexual orientation, and gender identity. In other words, the department proposes to interpret Section 1557 as if it created special privileges for new classes of people, defined in ways that are highly ideological and unscientific. The redefinition of sex to cover gender identity and sexual orientation and pregnancy to cover abortion should be reversed in all HHS and CMS programs as was done under the Trump administration. This includes the Children's Health Insurance Program, CHIP. Low-income families who rely on CHIP should not be coerced, pressured, or otherwise encouraged to embrace this ideologically motivated sexualization of their children. However, while the Biden administration's Section 1557 regulation should be altered and corrected, the lactation room requirements added in the regulation should either be consistently included in any upcoming Section 1557 rulemaking or be proposed in a new individual rule. COVID-19 vaccination and mask requirements. Healthcare workers were praised for their self-sacrifice in caring for sick patients at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, but then they were fired if they objected to receiving COVID-19 vaccines with or without complying with onerous masking requirements, and regardless of whether they already had the virus and had gained natural immunity. With the disease being endemic and constantly mutating, vaccines and universal masking in healthcare facilities do not have appreciable benefits in reducing COVID-19 transmission throughout the community. Moreover, more recent COVID strains pose fewer health risks than the earlier strains, and the pandemic has been declared to be at an end. CMS should announce non-enforcement of the Biden administration's COVID-19 vaccination mandate on Medicaid and Medicare hospitals. Revoke corresponding guidance and regulations. Refrain from imposing general COVID-19 mask mandates on healthcare facilities or personnel. Pay damages to all medical professionals who were dismissed directly because of the CMS vaccine mandate. Administration for Children and Families, ACF. TNF. The Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, TNF, program is a federal block grant that gives states significant flexibility to fund a broad array of programs aimed at helping low-income families break the cycle of poverty and achieve economic self-sufficiency. States use TNF to fund monthly cash assistance payments to low-income families with children, as well as a wide range of services that include work activities, work supports and supportive services, childcare, administration and systems, tax credits, pre-K/Head Start, child welfare, and other services. The TNF program serves 1.8 million individuals. Since 1996, when the program was reformed, federal TNF outlays have been $16.5 billion. The state match is $14.9 billion, bringing the total state and federal TNF investment to $31.4 billion. The TNF statute requires that states engage 50% of single-parent families in work for at least 30 hours a week, 20 hours a week for single parents with children under age 6. Those states have the option to waive the requirement for families with children under the age of 6, and most do. States also have 90% work requirements for two-parent families to engage in work for 35 hours per week. Because of the caseload reduction credit, states' work engagement targets are reduced if their assistance caseloads have fallen since 2005. As a result, 21 states had a work engagement target of 0% in 2017. Generally, states apply their work requirement only to beneficiaries receiving basic assistance, who account for 22.3% of TNF outlays. The Trump administration proposed a Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, rule to increase program integrity and reduce fraud, waste, and abuse. That would have prevented an individual from qualifying for SNAP simply because he or she received a pamphlet from the TNF program. This rule defined non-cash benefits as those that are worth at least $50 a month and received for at least 6 months. The tenets of this rule should be applied to the TNF program as well. This definitional change would apply the TNF work requirements to any non-cash benefit worth $50 a month and received for 6 consecutive months. To increase transparency, HHS should clarify how states, in their quarterly and annual reports, ought to track and audit the outcomes from how they spend TNF funds to meet the TNF program's 4 statutory purposes. Additionally, TNF priorities are not implemented in an equally weighted way. Marriage, healthy family formation, and delaying sex to prevent pregnancy are virtually ignored in terms of priorities, yet these goals can reverse the cycle of poverty in meaningful ways. CMS should require explicit measurement of these goals. Teen Pregnancy Prevention, TPP, and Personal Responsibility Education Program, PrEP. TPP is operated by the Office of Population Affairs in the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Health. PrEP is operated by the ACF Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation. Both programs should ensure that there is better reporting of subgrantees and referral lists so that they do not promote abortion or high-risk sexual behavior among adolescents. CMS should ensure that sexual risk avoidance, SRA, proponents receive these grants and are given every opportunity to prove their effectiveness. SRA programs, both at ACF and at OSH and both discretionary and mandatory, should be equal in funding and emphasis. Qualitative research should be conducted on both types of programs to ensure continuous improvement. In addition, certain provisions should be employed so that these programs do not serve as advocacy tools to promote sex, promote prostitution, or provide a funnel effect for abortion facilities and school field trips to clinics, or for similar purposes. Parent involvement and parent-child communication should be encouraged and be a part of any funded project. Risk avoidance should be prioritized, and any program that submits a proposal that promotes risk rather than health should not be eligible for funding. Site visits should be revamped to ensure adherence to these optimal health metrics, and a cost analysis of programming as compared to students served should be a metric in funding, taking into account that in certain cases, intensive programs will serve fewer students and can have more positive results. These same parameters should apply to sex education programs at ACF. Any lists with approved curriculum or so-called evidence-based lists should be abolished. HHS should not create a monopoly of curriculum, adding to the profit of certain publishers. Furthermore, lists created in the past have given priority to sex promotion textbooks. HHS should create a list of criteria for evaluating the sort of curriculum that should be selected for any sex education grant programs, both at OSH and at ACF, with the aim of promoting optimal health and adhering to the legislative language of each program. Adoption reform. There are roughly 400,000 children across the nation on the waiting list for foster care and 100,000 awaiting adoptive families, and the opioid/fentanyl crisis is putting more at risk every day. Unfortunately, many of the faith-based adoption agencies that serve these children are under threat from lawsuits, or else their licenses and contracts have been halted because they cannot in good conscience place children in every household due to their religious belief that a child should have a married mother and father. HHS, through ACF and the Assistant Secretary for Financial Resources, ASFAR, should repeal the unnecessary 2016 regulation that imposes non-statutory sexual orientation and gender identity non-discrimination conditions on agency grants and return to the policy of maximizing the options for placing vulnerable children in their forever homes. ACF and OCR should also survey their programs to consider whether additional waivers of HHS grant conditions, waivers the Biden administration revoked in 2021, are needed for faith-based agencies. Additionally, Congress should pass the Child Welfare Provider Inclusion Act to ensure that providers and organizations cannot be subjected to discrimination for providing adoption and foster care services based on their beliefs about marriage. Office of Refugee Resettlement, ORR. The Office of Refugee Resettlement should be moved to the Department of Homeland Security. Having health and welfare functions managed by HHS and border security functions managed by DHS has created intolerable failures in both. HHS and ORR have forgotten their original refugee resettlement mission and instead have provided a panoply of free programs that incentivize people to come to the U.S. illegally. Even more troubling, ORR has too often placed children into dangerous situations when releasing them into the country. Nearly all of HHS's care, custody, and placement of children is done through cooperative agreements with private agencies, many of which may have broken federal law by inducing or being accomplices in illegal immigration. Those arrangements could be handled far more effectively by DHS. Congress should reform the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act to transfer all ORR duties for unaccompanied alien children to DHS and eliminate the Flores Settlement Agreement. Regardless of where ORR's functions reside, ORR staff and care providers should never be allowed to facilitate abortions for unaccompanied children in its custody, including by transporting minors across state lines from pro-life states to abortion-friendly states. Pregnant, unaccompanied girls in ORR custody should be treated with dignity, not trafficked across state lines to be victimized by the abortion industry. ORR should withdraw its policy of allowing elective abortions for children in ORR care and issue a new policy of instructing care providers not to allow girls to be transported for elective abortions. HHS, OGC, and the White House should insist that DOJ fight to defend that policy up to the U.S. Supreme Court in light of Dobbs. Office of Child Support Enforcement, OCC. Congress established aid to families with dependent children in 1935 to assist single-parent families who were suffering financially from the loss of a breadwinning husband and father. Within 2 decades, however, the majority of families receiving aid were dependent because of paternal abandonment rather than death. Today, nearly a third of America's children live without a father present in the home, and a fourth of them are enrolled to receive child support. The glaring issue in child support enforcement today is a non-resident father's ability to provide full or consistent child support payments. The literature reflects this divide as fathers have been categorized as deadbeat dads, then as dead broke dads, and now as disconnected dads who do not commit to the mother and child. Child support in the United States should strengthen marriage as the norm, restore broken homes, and encourage unmarried couples to commit to marriage. Child support tax credit. National or state guidelines and tax law should be updated to ensure that non-resident parents with child support orders can receive a non-dependent child support tax credit. Single filers of up to $41,756 and married or joint filers of up to $47,646 would be eligible for a child support tax credit similar to the current earned income tax credit. Filers could receive a maximum of $538 in annual returns for one child and a maximum of $3,584 in annual returns for 2 or more children, based on a credit rate of 34%. A child support tax credit would use the low-income, non-resident parents' own earned income and history of employment to assist them further in the task of caring for their children. The key to this policy is that it empowers fathers with their own resources and money rather than creating another government assistance program or a fully refundable credit, devoid of the father's own monetary efforts. This way, the non-resident father's role as financial provider and relational figure is affirmed, and much-needed financial resources are given to the children. Visitation. Visitation is key to revitalizing child support and increasing payment frequency. The most effective way to lower a non-resident parent's monthly child support order is to spend more court-accounted for time with the child. For example, Texas combined its child support court with its visitation court to ensure that resident and non-resident parents received state-mandated financial support orders and enforceable visitation orders. Child support payment and interactive smartphone application. Each state should be induced to implement a high-tech, easy-to-use application to centralize child support payments. As with Venmo or Cash App, non-resident parents would link their bank accounts and provide one-click monthly payments, or contribute incrementally throughout the month while tracking how much is due. Additionally, the non-resident parents could track informal gifts from money, groceries, clothes, sports gear, and more through the app. This would address one of the main issues within current child support payment systems. Non-resident parents claim that they are spending much of their own money to provide for children outside of their monthly payments, and resident parents claim that they spend little and neglect their official child support orders. Currently, only the latter claim can be tracked reliably. This process would enable non-resident parents to track the amount of informal support they provide and the reason for it while ensuring that the resident parent acknowledges and accepts the contribution. Page 479. End hour 15.